Okay, this is Harold. I'm making another recording. So this is really for class number 3. I should say in class number 3, we're going to talk about chapter 4, but I've already made a video for chapter 4 that I'll put up there. So I'm going to skip up all the way up to chapter 5. And then I'll crank away. So so there's a 20-minute video. So that's on the course website that's got chapter 4 already. I'm going to start with chapter 5, and really talking about how we meddle with markets, sneaking in a little deadweight loss action, and it's really the basic supply and demand stuff, but but bringing in how we can cause inefficiencies sometimes by interfering with markets, and sometimes not. And we'll talk about a couple of interesting policy dilemmas on the way. So a well-functioning market is effective, as I kind of mentioned in the last class, because you've got two things going for it. You've got well-defined property rights, and you've got economic signals, usually in the form of prices, that signal just prices basically say, this is what the demand side is willing to pay. This is what it costs the supply side to produce the good. So that's really valuable information to efficiently allocate resources. Now, property rights, we're going to come back to this again, particularly when we talk about environmental stuff. Property rights are sort of interesting legal entitlements that we have. That, sometimes my property right is whatever I do on my property is my business. I own this thing. I own this soda. I can drink it. I can, splash it on myself. I can do whatever I want to do. I own it. Sometimes property rights are a little bit more complicated, like my right to have unpolluted drinking water or to have my street quiet. And it turns out as long as property rights are unambiguous, very often we can reach an efficient outcome. There's something called the Coase theorem that we'll come to later on. And property rights can also include intellectual property. I figured out how to make an mRNA vaccine work, and I can get a patent on it. That's a property right. Okay. An economic signal is any piece of information that helps people make better economic decisions. So as I mentioned, prices are really important signals in a market economy. Prices don't work great, by the way, when there's externalities. If the price of a good doesn't include, I did an incredible amount of damage to the environment to produce that good, then that price is giving the wrong signal, and we got a problem. So, but when stuff like that's not happening, then prices are incredibly valuable. Okay. So, here's an interesting question for you. So, let's say you live in Cape Cod off of Massachusetts, and there's an unexpected snowstorm, and that snowstorm basically closes off the bridges and blocks access to food and fuel deliveries from the rest of Massachusetts. My dad lived in Massachusetts for years in Cape Cod, and stuff like this was some people worried about. Let's think about the following two situations and think about how they're same and how they're different. So there's a local 7-Eleven on Cape Cod, and it doubles the price of milk and eggs, when the storm hits. The local Walmart charges $50 for shovels, which it normally charges $25. It actually keeps some shovels in the basement just to make money in that situation. By the way, I don't know why I decided not to put a space in between to and make. I guess that's because that's our little, little inside. I'm part of the neoliberal conspiracy econ thing to not put that space there. Now let's think about how you might want to regulate that if you're a policymaker. You might want to think about what's the same and what's different about these two situations. In both cases, you could imagine you'd be really annoyed as a consumer if you walk in, I want to buy a snow shovel. It's, all of a sudden we got a crisis, there's a snowstorm, everybody needs a snow shovel. You show up at the Walmart and all of a sudden the snow shovels are $50. And you're like, WTF, they're usually $25. Or you go to the 7-Eleven and you just want to buy a quart of milk and all of a sudden it's super expensive. And you could imagine that, policymakers sometimes try to regulate this, and they sort of talk about how, people shouldn't be gouging and taking advantage of an emergency situation. Boy, this is really, I don't know why I've got so many typos there. I was in a hurry. Sorry about that. I'll fix that on the slides. Now, what's interesting is these are actually different things. So what you're buying when you buy that shovel at Walmart is you're not actually buying a snow shovel at Walmart, a normal snow shovel. What you're buying is a special snow shovel that they kept in reserve for you for the emergency. And they've got these things down in the basement that you're essentially paying for emergency preparedness. So The Economist actually says it's good that Walmart's getting $50 for those shovels, because what it will do is it will encourage Walmart to just keep a bunch of extra shovels in the basement for an emergency so they can make money. And what you're actually paying for is the fact that they had to buy those snow shovels and keep them in the basement without making any money on them for 2 years waiting for that emergency. So you're not buying a snow shovel, you're buying that reserved snow shovel that's there for emergencies. So there's a long-term supply curve for emergency preparedness that is price sensitive. And because it's price sensitive, we want to give people incentives to stock up on emergency supplies, flashlights, snow shovels, things like that. And when they charge a lot during an emergency, they're recouping the investment they've made to prepare for that emergency. Now, how to make sure everybody gets a snow shovel who needs a snow shovel, that's a challenge. But from an efficiency perspective, you can see the argument for that. Milk and eggs are perishable. That 7-Eleven dude who wants to jack up the price, he's not doing anything good by jacking up the price during the emergency. There's no particular, that's just taking advantage of an emergency. And you can see how we might say, you know what, you can't do that. I'm gonna make a note to fix typos. That's really embarrassing. There's no long-term supply curve for perishable goods. There's just a short-term supply curve. So you could imagine we could pass a law that says you can't raise the price of milk and eggs during an emergency. It's not going to reduce the incentives for emergency preparedness, because you kind of can't do emergency preparedness, with these perishable goods anyway. Okay? Just a picture of a bridge from, I think this is from the Gleacher Center. There's no good pictures in these slides, by the way. So let me talk about deadweight loss, or DWL. That's a fancy term for inefficiencies. And inefficiencies, it's actually in units of dollars. So price times quantity. The price is dollars per quantity. So you multiply dollars per quantity times quantity, you get dollars. So deadweight loss is a dollar valued inefficiency that's happening because something is not working properly in a market. Some examples of deadweight loss. The two most common ones are underproduction and overproduction of a good. So the underproduction of a good can happen in two ways. So one is you have a monopolist. So let's say that I'm selling software. I have a monopoly on Windows software. It doesn't cost me anything. And Microsoft basically doesn't cost me anything to make another copy. But what I want to do is I want to create a shortage of this so that I can charge people $100 for it. And then, so I'm charging a lot of money, and I want the consumers who are on the very left-hand side of the demand curve to be the ones buying it for $100. And that's inefficient because, at least in the short run, I'm ignoring the incentives to produce Windows in the first place, which Microsoft's lawyers would be quick to talk about. But the basic idea is there's lots of people who say would get $75 worth of benefit from the Microsoft Windows. Costs them zero to give them to give you a copy of it, but they don't want to do that because they want to be able to charge people $100 for it. So there's a social loss, all the consumer surplus that people who are willing to pay a lot but not willing to pay $100 for that Windows software, was lost to them by that really high price. Things that are kind of like the monopoly pricing come up in different ways. So for example, in the pre-Uber and Lyft days, in order to drive a taxi around Chicago, New York, Boston, you have to have what was called a medallion. You had to pay for this piece of metal that you stuck on the front of your taxi cab, and that gave you the right to run around and charge people to drive, for cab rides. And there were only so many of these medallions given out. They typically, the medallion itself often cost, $200,000, something like that. And it gave you the right to drive a cab or to hire someone else to drive that cab. And you could rent out your medallion, something like that. And you're kind of creating this, by only having a certain number of these medallions, local governments created a shortage where essentially they created a little monopoly in the ability to allow people to drive cabs and to provide cab services. And so local zoning regulations are a little bit like that too. Suppose that I live in Berkeley, California, and I have really nice houses that sell for $1 million. And we have local zoning regulations that sort of limit the construction of high density housing. What I'm trying to do is create a shortage so that if I'm an incumbent homeowner, my property is worth more. And there's some complexity to it, but there's a monopoly pricing aspect of it too. Underproduction also happens when we put on sales taxes, and we'll come back to that. So if you put on a sales tax, what it does is, at the margin, it makes it more expensive for producers to produce a good, and they're not going to produce something where it would cost them less to produce it than the consumer would gain value from it, but not enough to make up for the taxes. So there's some underproduction when we tax a good that is that leads to this deadweight loss. Now sometimes you have overproduction, and you can get deadweight loss. Say if you subsidize a good, let's suppose that we subsidize farmers incredibly to grow wheat and corn in some way. What they're going to do is they're going to grow a ton of wheat and corn, even if it costs the society more to produce that corn, at least at the margin, then consumers are really benefiting from it. So you can end up with an just inefficient overproduction, where you end up, say, throwing the corn out because there's more corn than consumers really want because we're subsidizing its production heavily. Generally, in economics, the underproduction deadweight losses are the ones that we focus on, but overproduction can matter too. And I must say, by the way, if there's a big externality in production, overproduction also can become a serious inefficiency. For example, if there's pollution involved that causes dollar harms to the rest of the society, leaving aside climate change, but just particulate pollution that causes a problem, you can also get inefficient overproduction if producers don't and consumers of the good don't have to pay for the economic harm they cause to other people, in that process. Here's just a sneak peek of the deadweight loss that comes with monopoly. This is actually from chapter 13, and we're going to get to it. Turns out that this curve here that says MR stands for marginal revenue. It's the extra dollar that you get in your cash register, extra dollars you get if you produce one more unit, and if you're a monopolist. And there's sort of two pieces of that. One is somebody pays for that extra unit, but the other is you have to lower the prices a little bit because you've increased your supply a little bit. And so that marginal revenue takes into account that you're trying to optimize where you are on the demand curve. So if you have a good that doesn't cost anything to produce, it turns out that you pick the quantity where I keep producing until the marginal revenue of producing one more unit goes negative. If I end up with less money in my cash register if I produce another unit because I've driven the demand down, that's where I stop. And I sort of pick this point, this quantity here, and whatever the price is at this quantity is what the monopolist wants to charge. Doesn't matter the details right now, but the point is the monopolist creates a shortage, and what the efficient outcome is actually to produce out here, but the monopolist doesn't want to do that. They want to produce half that amount and charge a lot of money for the good. So a perfectly competitive industry, actually, if there's some sort of a flat cost curve, it costs $200, say, to mine a diamond, the efficient outcome is charge everybody $200 for a diamond. But the monopolist would be stupid to do that. The monopolist is going to charge a lot more than that. Okay. So what the monopolist is going to do in this particular case, the monopolist says, I'm going to produce 8 million. And at that quantity, it turns out that a price of $600 is what the price has to be for consumers to demand this amount. Turns out that the monopolist makes a big profit. That's the difference between the monopolist cost here and the price that they get. So every diamond they sell, they make 600 minus 200, which is $400 profit, and they're selling 8 million units. So their profit is this. The society, of course, wants them to be out here, but at that point, they're not making any profit. And so you might say, what's inefficient about this situation? The problem from a social perspective is not so much that the monopolist is making money, it's that all of these consumers in here are getting zero consumer surplus. They're not going to buy anything. They're not going to buy a diamond if it, they're willing to pay less than $600 for it. It's only costing the society $200 to mine these diamonds. So this triangle in here is consumer surplus that's lost. And because the monopolist is overcharging, and that's the inefficiency that comes with monopoly, and that's called the deadweight loss of monopoly. So we'll come back to this, but the basic idea is there's underproduction because the monopolist wants to make a shortage so he can charge a high price. Here's a sales tax. By the way, I have this nice little web app that I made, but so let's suppose that we have a sales tax on producers. And so, and I actually made this picture from my web app, which I'll try to use it in class. Here, let's say here's the producer's supply curve if there's no sales tax, but we're going to put a sales tax on, and in this particular case, the sales tax is $20. What it does is it shifts up the entire supply curve by $20. So it go from this sort of brown thing to this kind of green thing. And the equilibrium in the market goes from, it would have been this point if there was no sales tax, that's where supply and demand equilibrate. Well, with this new supply curve that's got the higher production cost due to the tax, we're at this point here. So what's lost? All the consumer surplus that these consumers would have gotten, that is, that exceeds the cost that the producers would have had to have undergone to provide that good. So the area of this triangle in here is the deadweight loss. It's the lost producer surplus and the consumer surplus. Just because these transactions are not happening because we put the tax on. So there would have been something like 66 sold, and there's a lot less over here. Okay. And so we'll see if we can do the Shiny app in the class, so we can walk through this. So there's underconsumption of the good that's leading to a deadweight loss. Now let's think about what happens if there's a subsidy paid to the producer that's inefficient. So now you're subsidizing the producer, the supply curve actually shifts down by the amount of the subsidy, because every time they make one more unit of something, they're getting paid for it. And now what's interesting is, here's what the equilibrium would have been if there was no subsidy. Now we're over here at a new equilibrium. That's the subsidized supply curve, where that hits the demand curve. And you might say, well, how is that inefficient? Well, it turns out that every consumer along here, they're valuing the good at the height of the demand curve. But how much does it cost society to produce that good? It actually costs the society the height of the supply curve. That's one way we think about the supply curves. The height of the supply curve is how much it costs the society to produce that one more unit. Well, it's costing the society more money to produce all of the goods that are supplied to these people, then those people actually benefit from. And it turns out that the difference is this triangle in here. It's that we're inefficiently subsidizing the good. And so we have another triangle, a deadweight loss triangle, but here it's coming from, we're subsidizing a good really heavily that consumers just would not have bought if they had to really pay the full price for it. Okay. Now let's think about quantity constraints. So like taxi medallions or restrictive zoning, something like that. So before we're talking about something where we're changing the price of a good by putting a tax on it. What happens if we just say, hey, we're going to fix the amount that people can sell? There's only so many taxi medallions available, something like that. Okay. So let's think about taxi rides in the absence of some government control. Here's a supply and a demand curve for taxi rides. And if you just let the market do its thing, there would be 10 million taxi rides and the fare per ride would be $5. And that's this point right here. Okay? So all is beautiful, it's just taxi rides cost $5. Okay? And you can see that, it's the market clearing price. Now, what happens if we put in a quota and we say, well, you can't have 10 million rides, you can only have 8 million rides. So there's this vertical line that's right here that just says you can't be to the right of that line. Well, the price of a taxi ride is going to be wherever the demand hits that quantity. So the taxi rides have to be $6 because that's the price at which you're actually going to have 8 million taxi rides. Okay? So the number of taxi rides goes down by 2 million. Okay? So now you might say, who's winning and who's losing from this? All of the people on the supply curve here, they were providing taxi rides before when taxis were $5. They're still providing taxi rides now the taxi rides are $6, and they're getting an extra $1 for each ride. So these suppliers are winning. And they're extracting, by the way, they're extracting consumer surplus from these cab riders. It's just a straight financial transfer from this part of the demand curve to this part of the supply curve. That's straightforward winners and losers. But what's happening over here is all of these taxi drivers, they were getting consumer surplus, they were getting producer surplus before. They were getting actually this triangle right in here was producer surplus. And then now they're not getting that anymore. These consumers up here, they were getting a consumer surplus, which was this triangle here. They're not getting that anymore. So this whole triangle here is now lost. It's deadweight loss. Okay. And it's pretty straightforward what it is, which is that it's 2 million rides times the average dollar cost, so the average difference between how much consumers valued the good, which is the height of the blue line, and how much it would have cost producers to produce it, which is that red line. And it turns out it's you do 1/2 base times the height. The height here is 2 million. And on average, it turns out that that the difference between this blue curve and the red curve is 1 million. It's half of this thing. So it's 1/2 base times the height is the area of this triangle. That's the deadweight loss that comes from this quota that's imposed. Okay. So, and by the way, if you just want to work that out, you will see, that is that should be what, 1/2 the base, which is $2, times the height, which is 2 million. So it's about $2 million that's lost. Right? It's because we blocked these transactions that people would have benefited from. Okay. Now, by the way, as we've mentioned in other cases, there's the deadweight loss. There's also, of course, incentives for illegal activities. One could be, what are sometimes called gypsy cabs. Not my favorite expression, but unlicensed cabs, and of course, alternate models like Uber came in and actually probably did a good thing in terms of their economic efficiency. Although many of the tactics that Uber used were unethical or illegal. But in terms of the benefit to consumers, there was a real benefit. Okay. Now let's talk about elasticity in Chapter 6. Let's kind of crank away on that a little bit. Okay. So why is elasticity used to measure the response to changes in prices or income? What are the different elasticity measures and what do they mean? And kind of what influences the size of these elasticities, which is really, elasticity is kind of another word for sensitivity, you'll see, or flexibility. And why is it important to determine the size of the relevant elasticity before setting prices or government fees? Okay. So here's just an example. So turns out, if you take it turns out ambulance rides are unbelievably expensive. My wife had a heart problem, and I remember we paid as much for the ambulance ride as we did for the hospital services, essentially, by the time our insurance was done. So here's somebody, they paid $1,772 for driving 9 miles in an ambulance. Now, why are ambulances able to charge thousands of dollars? And the answer is basically, when you call an ambulance, you're not really ready to haggle. It's you're really insensitive to price in that moment, and so your price elasticity of demand is very low. I'm just not going to be sensitive to price and whether or not I call that ambulance. My wife had chest pains. You got to do it. You got to do what you got to do. Demand is elastic when an increase in price greatly reduces the quantity demanded. That's an elastic demand curve, sensitive to price. Demand is inelastic when an increase in price doesn't really change demand very much. It'll change, maybe it'll go down a little bit, but it won't go down very much. Now, I should say price elasticity of demand is generally different at any point along a given demand curve. Any given demand curve, there's not just one value of price elasticity of demand. It depends where it's crossing the supply curve, what point you're at, or what's being charged, what's the price being charged. So so if you calculate the price elasticity of demand for a given demand curve at one point, it's going to be different than another point. Yeah. Now, what's the definition of price elasticity of demand? This is important. So that's my dishwasher, by the way, in the background. They're, sorry about that. Price elasticity of demand is the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. So if we raise the price by 1%, what's the percentage change in the quantity demanded that accompanies that? By the way, price elasticity of demand, it's going to be a negative number because if I raise the price, people are going to want less of that good. So the price elasticity of demand is a negative number. And it turns out if people are really sensitive to price, it's a negative number that's less than -1. It's like -2. The magnitude is, it's a negative number that is, that's to the left of -1 on the number line. If demand is inelastic, it's typically between -1 and 0. It's a negative number, but it's a small negative number. The price elasticity of demand, always negative. And if people are sensitive to price, it's a big negative number. And you'll see that when it's exactly -1, unit elastic, that's sort of a noteworthy threshold. Okay? So here's an example. The price of oil increases by 10% and the quantity demanded falls by 5%. Then the price elasticity of demand for oil is -5% divided by 10%, or -0.5. It's a pretty inelastic demand curve. Okay. Now I should say, by the way, when we talk about this stuff, we often leave out the negative sign when we're just talking about it. We said price elasticity demand 0.5. We mean negative 0.5, but economists often leave off the minus sign when we're talking about it. So we can be a little sloppy about that. So you always have to be careful. Price elasticity demand is always negative, unless there's some really weird thing going on. You know, like buying perfume for your girlfriend or something like that. Okay. So now I mentioned that price elasticity of demand is different at different points along the demand curve. So if you have two markets that are really quite different, you could imagine the same demand curve, you get different elasticities. You know, your gasoline's a lot more expensive in Europe than in the United States. So you could imagine that things are gonna be a little different because they're just at such different price points. Okay? Now, we often do this thing called the midpoint formula. And where we actually say the percentage change in X, say there's a big price change. What we do is we actually, we do this midpoint formula that's in the book where we sort of say, well, let's pick the, X goes from 100 to 50. Let's kind of use 75 as the reference point for that because it's such a big change. And so we take the change in X divided by the average value of X times 100. So 50. So if X goes from 100 to 50, the midpoint method says take 100 minus 50, but then divide by 75 and do the same thing, when we get to the price side of things. So there's this thing called the midpoint formula. It's actually not important, but if you have a large price change, we often do that because elasticity can change, changes over that whole range in the demand curve. So there's just a formula that that you can see. Here's the midpoint formula. So the initial price of $10, people want 100. Price goes up to 20, all of a sudden people only want 90. So let's calculate the price elasticity of demand. The percent change in price, we say it's 20 minus 10, but then we pick as the reference point the midpoint of that, $15. So it's $10 divided by $15, 66% change in price. Okay. And then and then we say the percentage change in quantity demanded. This is demand went from 90 to 100, or from 100 to 90. But in the denominator, instead of putting one of those points, we kind of take the midpoint, 95. So the percentage change in quantity demanded by the midpoint method, we get 10.5%. And so the price elasticity of demand becomes 0.16. Notice, by the way, that the textbook left off the minus sign. But a very inelastic demand curve that's being shown here. Okay. So you can see that this is, this slide comes from Krugman and Wells. You can see that they just left off the minus sign because they did. Okay. So here you can try doing an example yourself, and I'm going to skip the answer so that you can work it out yourself. Yeah, I realize you could come back and figure out what I said. Now, let's think about what price elasticity of demand is for some common goods that people buy. And there's a short run aspect and there's a long run aspect. Remember I said in lecture 2 that over the long run, people are more sensitive to price than in the short run. So like you take gasoline, if gasoline gets really expensive in the short run, there's not much I can do about it, but in the long run, I might buy a hybrid car or something like that. Turns out that if you look at the data, in the short run, the price elasticity of demand for gasoline is like 0.09, not very inelastic. The long run is 0.24. People do make changes. And again, they've left off all the minus signs on all this. If you look at college tuition, in-state college tuition is pretty inelastic. It's between 0.6 and 0.75, pretty inelastic. Airline travel starts to be interesting enough, it says business travel here, less than unit elastic. A demand curve where you get a number that's less than 1, that's pretty insensitive to price. Business traveling, people are pretty price insensitive, and it's basically because they're spending other people's money. And it turns out soda, people are, in general, if you raise the price of soda, people don't change how much soda they consume all that much. These are inelastic because they're all absolute value less than 1. And again, we've left off all the negative signs. Elastic demand. When the price of housing goes up, people buy less housing, or they buy a smaller house. They pick up a roommate, something like that. They'll spend less money on housing when housing, gets more expensive. Out-of-state tuition colleges, people are more price sensitive. So, if I live in Illinois and I want to go to Urbana, well, if they raise the price of Urbana-Champaign, I'm still probably doing better in state than going out of state. I'm not super price sensitive about Urbana, but if I'm thinking, well, maybe I should go to Michigan, and then Michigan raises their price and it's an out-of-state tuition, well, I'm more sensitive to that price. Leisure travel, people are pretty price sensitive about the price of airline tickets. Now here it's Coke versus Pepsi. So this is not soda, this is Coke, or this is Pepsi. And the idea is that if you raise the price of Pepsi, there's a bunch of people like, screw it, I'm just going to drink Coke instead. There's a close substitute, and that makes people very price sensitive. There's a very elastic demand relationship, okay? Here's some extreme cases of price elasticity of demand, okay? Here is a vertical demand curve. Okay. So there's just a particular, whatever the price is, I basically want a fixed amount of that thing. So here they have snake anti-venom. Imagine I just got bitten by a snake, and I need whatever the dose is. That's what I need. And whatever the price is, I'm going to pay it. I don't really want more than that. I don't want less than that either. Okay. So in this case, my demand curve is essentially vertical at 1 dose. Okay. So fixed quantity is vertical. How about now? Here's something else. The price of pink tennis balls per dozen. Let's suppose that there's lots of tennis balls of different colors available, and blue tennis balls cost $5. And so blue tennis balls cost $5. Well, I'm willing to buy a lot of pink tennis balls if they're $5. But suppose the price of tennis balls goes from $5 to $6. I'm not going to buy any pink tennis balls. I'm just going to buy blue ones. If the price of pink tennis balls drops below $5, then I'm going to buy a ton of them. Sorry, I'm trying to find my cursor. Here we go. This is a very, very price sensitive demand curve. Basically, it's super sensitive. The price changes a little bit. If it gets a little bit higher, I go, whoops, all the way back to 0. If the price drops a little bit, wow, I scooch over to buying a ton. So this is a really, really price sensitive demand curve. Okay. And the idea is that there's a big market out there for tennis balls. If the pink tennis balls are just a little bit cheaper than the blue ones, wow, a lot of people are going to buy the pink ones. And if they're a little bit more expensive than the blue ones, they're not going to sell any. That's what's being shown in that. Okay. So just here's the, whoops. So an increase in price here just doesn't lead to any change in the quantity demanded. Here, even a small change in price, wow, leads to huge changes in the quantity demanded. Okay. Turns out this is, by the way, the demand curve that a firm in a very, very competitive market, that's what they tend to be looking at. If I'm like one bagel shop on a street with 10 other bagel shops, the demand curve for my product looks a lot like this. This in some ways is kind of the demand curve. I'm at the 7-Eleven and at the Cape Cod, and there's just been a snowstorm, and now there's no more eggs coming in. no more milk coming in. This is just how much I've got. So a good can have a price elasticity of demand as low as 0. People are completely not sensitive to changes in price, or it can be as high as infinity. Inelastic demand curves, that's when the price elasticity of demand is between -1 and 0. If a price elasticity of demand is less than -1, and it's -2, say, we call that demand curve elastic. And if it's exactly -1, then we say that the demand curve is unit elastic. Okay? And again, we kind of ignore the algebraic signs here because that's what we do in economics. Here's a unit elastic demand curve here. So here, point A, the thing costs 90 cents and people would buy 1,100 units. If the price went up to $1.10, people would buy only 900 units. Turns out if you work out the price elasticity of demand between these 2 points, it's -1. Note that the total amount that people have spent on this good stays exactly the same. In one case, it's 1,100 times 90 cents. In the other case, it's 900 times $1.10, works out to be exactly the same. So price times the quantity, the revenue, the total amount spent on that good is unchanged if you change the price when the demand curve is unit elastic. If the demand curve is unit elastic, the amount of money people spend on the good does not change when the price changes. Okay? That's one reason why the unit elastic thing is kind of a critical thing to pay attention to. Turns out if the demand curve is inelastic and you raise the price, people spend more money on the good, which I talked about, in the drug war context. If people are really price sensitive and the price elasticity of demand is like -2, turns out if you raise the price, people spend less money on the good. People just cut it way back. Here's an inelastic demand curve. And in this case, you can work out, I'll leave for you, figure out, roughly speaking, what's the quantity demanded going to be if you raise the price to $1.10. And if you work that out, it turns out it's about 950. Okay. So in this case, if you raise the price, you're actually increasing the amount of money that people spend. I'll let you work that out. Okay. Here's an elastic demand curve. Notice, so the elastic is pretty flat. That's how you know that you're really sensitive to prices. The demand curve looks pretty flat. Okay, so here we have, in this particular case, a 20% increase in the price leads to a 40% decrease in the quantity of the good that is consumed. Okay, so you can imagine a price increase leading to a big decline in the amount of dollars going into this market. Okay. Total revenue is price times quantity. Sellers need to know how elastic the demand curve is when they're trying to figure out, what should I price my good at? And as I mentioned, the total revenue is price times quantity. Now, one thing that's useful to know, sorry, I keep hitting advance. It must be annoying for you to watch. I'm sorry about that. When a seller raises the price of a good, there's 2 countervailing effects. There's the price effect. So just, for every good that I sell, I'm getting a higher price for it. That raises revenue. That's called the price effect. But there's also a quantity effect. When the price increases, I'm selling fewer units. And that's pushing to lower my revenue. So one of the things that sellers always pay attention to is, which is kind of bigger, the price effect or the quantity effect. And if the demand curve is unit elastic, it turns out these 2 things exactly balance each other off. If demand is inelastic, then the price effect is bigger than the quantity effect. If demand is very elastic, then the quantity effect is actually bigger than the price effect. You might want to, if you want to, you can run that back. Inelastic demand, price effect is bigger than the quantity effect. Elastic demand, the price effect is a lot smaller than the quantity effect. Okay. So here we can sort of work this thing out. So here's an example where there's a, this is unit elastic. So the quantity effect is really this rectangle A. I've increased the price and I'm just going to sell fewer units. And that's really captured here. The price effect is, well, each unit that I sell, I get a lot more money. By the way, notice this little, we're sort of leaving out this little triangle area. If it's a small change in price, that's going to be quite tiny. So one of the things that we're trying to pay attention to is which of these rectangles is bigger, A or C. And that's where the elasticity of the curve matters a lot. So when demand is inelastic, price effect dominates. When demand is elastic, vice versa. Okay. So that's that. And again, unit elastic, no change in total revenue when you have a change in price. Okay. So TR is total revenue. It's price times quantity. It's not Teddy Roosevelt. It's total revenue. Okay. So at any point in the demand curve, you can plot out what the total revenue is. And so here, for this particular straight line demand curve, it's all been worked out in this table. So you can look at that. Okay. As I mentioned, the price elasticity of demand is different at every point along the demand curve. Typically, if you think about what's happening sort of way up here, a small percentage change in price corresponds to a really large percentage change in quantity. So this is the elasticity formula gives you a big answer here. Down here, a really big percentage change in price going from say 2 to 1 is leading to a pretty small percentage change in the quantity demanded. So down here, the elasticity formula, I get a number that's pretty close to 0. So same curve, elasticity is going to be different at different points. By the total revenue, if you think about all the price points that one can pick, the total revenue kind of looks like an inverted U. So if you charge a sort of super high price and the quantity that people purchase is really low, you don't get that much revenue. If you charge a really low price and people buy a lot of it, but you charged a really low price, you don't get that much revenue either. There's kind of some, from the producer's point of view, there's kind of some point in the middle here where that I'm going to maximize my revenue, if that's what I'm trying to do. If the production costs are low, usually you kind of want to be somewhere where the revenue is pretty close to being maximized. Okay. So here we have, this is sort of a useful graph. So if you're way over here, sorry, let me find the cursor. If you're sort of way over here, you're at the part of the demand curve that's pretty inelastic in the price. So if you raise your price a little bit, you get a lot, the price effect really helps you, and and the quantity effect is really pretty small because you're in an inelastic part of the demand curve. So you keep increasing the price. At some point, the demand curve starts to look a lot more elastic. And then you sort of say, well, I'm going to stop raising my price at some point because at some point the quantity effect overtakes the price effect. In this particular example, it's at a quantity of 5. Okay. So here's an example where the elasticity demand is 0.1. Again, we've ignored the negatives. If you raise your price by 10%, what happens to your total revenue? It's going to go up because consumers are still going to buy basically the same amount. The demand curve is sort of super inelastic. So the total revenue is going to go up because actually the amount of, if you work out the elasticity formula, the people will buy 1% fewer eggs, 10% times 0.1. But each egg you're getting 10% more money. It's a big win in terms of revenue. Okay. So again, if the price elasticity of demand is minus 0.1, You raise your price by 10%, they're going to reduce their demand by 10% times minus 0.1, so that's 1%. Okay. Here's one: the price of t-shirts increases by 20%. As a result, t-shirt manufacturers experience an increase in total revenue. What does that tell you about the demand curve for the t-shirts? Demand has got to be pretty inelastic. They really had a big price increase and they still ended up with more money in the cash register. That means that demand was inelastic. What you do, by the way, if you're a monopolist, you keep raising your price until you really start to see a quantity effect, and that's when you stop. So you're always charging at some point along the demand curve where people are pretty price elastic. And the reason why you're doing that is if people weren't sensitive to price, you just keep increasing the price until they really stop buying. So if you're a monopolist, you just keep raising that price until you can really see people are just stopping buying, in enough, a big enough quantity effect that it overtakes your price effect. So the monopolist is always raising the price until they really start to see, oh, consumers are cutting back now. Then I've got to pull back on my price increase. So things that determine price elasticity of demand. One is necessities and luxuries. Generally, this is not strictly true, mathematically true, but it turns out for necessities, most of the time, demand is not that price sensitive. Overall, if sweaters are a necessity, and the price of sweaters goes up, people buy pretty much the same amount of sweaters. Now, if any one brand of sweater gets more expensive and other brands don't get more expensive, consumers might switch. So any particular brand of sweater is not a necessity, but the idea of having a sweater is a necessity. So for necessity, generally, demand curves tend to be pretty inelastic. For luxuries, then you see a little bit more price sensitivity, like vacation travel. If vacation travel becomes a lot more expensive, you do see people cutting back on it. And it's just, I don't have to go to Yellowstone this year or whatever. The availability of close substitutes, this is actually probably the single most important thing that determines the price elasticity of demand for something. If there's very few substitutes, then demand is pretty inelastic. But if there's lots of easy substitutes, then people really will be quite price sensitive. Imagine that, and if you think about it, the extreme case is just, I'm basically buying kind of the same product from two different producers, and they're just really very close substitutes. If one gas station raises the price of its gas, okay, it's special Shell 89 octane, it's slightly different from the Kmart 87 octane, but really close substitutes. If Shell tries to raise their price, I'm going to go to the other gas station. Right? By the way, egg and onion matzah and Munster cheese is great. No close substitutes for that. So if a patent expires on a brand name drug and 5 generic drugs come on the market, what happens to the elasticity of demand for the original drug? Clearly, consumers are going to be a lot more price elastic because now there's really close substitutes available. And so once the patent expires, close substitutes come on the market, which is going to make consumers a lot more price elastic regarding the original thing, if it's Lipitor or whatever it is. Okay? So of course, it's a bad day for the original manufacturer when their patent expires. The share of income spent on the good also tends to matter, partly because how much attention do I want to pay on comparison shopping? So, suppose that I spend a really small fraction of my income on a certain good. I'm really not going to comparison shop for it. My shoelaces. I could probably save a quarter on my shoelaces, which is actually a pretty high fraction of the cost of my shoelaces. If I actually, spend some time to figure out what the cheapest shoelaces were, I'm just not going to bother. So that makes the demand for shoelaces pretty inelastic. And we see things, for example, like in cooking, if you take something that's a small ingredient in a lot of stuff that we cook, we tend not to care about the price of that thing. You know, like the little McCormick spice thing or whatever, you know, we're not really price sensitive about that thing because it's going to be 1% of the price of making a cake. And so who cares? And yeah, and if you, by the way, are the person who is in that situation, that can be very lucrative for you. So suppose, for example, I'm a dock worker in San Francisco, and my job is to help unload the big screen TVs that are coming from Korea and Taiwan and Japan and China. My wage is a tiny fraction of the cost of that TV. If I can be a little bit safer in, you know, moving that TV or whatever, boy, that's going to be, I'm going to command a pretty high wage for that. And that, you know, they're just not going to, Samsung or whoever, they're really not going to spend a lot of time trying to get my wage down from $100,000 to $90,000. You know, if I'm a dock worker in that scenario, and if I'm just a little bit better, boy, you know, they just don't want to rock the boat in that. Time elapsed since the price change matters a lot. As I mentioned, in the short term, you know, we're just our demand is often inelastic, but over time, we can find substitutes, we can do other things that lessen our demand for a particular good. You know, if you know, the price of gasoline goes up, next time I buy a car, I'll buy a more fuel efficient car, or, you know, whatever the issue is, if there's time for me to make adjustments, the price of the original good tends to be more important. I've already mentioned the war on drugs issue. If the demand, at least in the short term for most illegal drugs, is pretty inelastic, things that reduce the supply of drugs probably increase the revenue that the drug dealers who can evade those enforcement mechanisms, you know, what they're going to get. And that's a real, this dynamic is a real problem. By the way, where do you think the DEA gets a lot of its intelligence on drug dealers? From other drug dealers who would just, you know, just assume that my major competitor gets arrested and that will help me. Cross price elasticity of demand. So how sensitive is the price, is the quantity demand of good A to the price of good B? So the cross price elasticity of demand is the percentage change in the quantity of A demanded divided by the percentage change in the price of B. Okay? Cross price elasticity of demand. For substitutes, the cross price elasticity of demand is positive. If you increase the price of Hydrox, you're going to increase the demand for Oreos. And the size of the cross price elasticity really tells you how closely substitutable the two goods are. So if you think about, say, hockey tickets versus basketball tickets that I mentioned in last class, there's going to be some kind of positive cross price elasticity of demand. We don't know actually how big that effect is. And it just depends on how many people are really making decisions. Should I go to hockey versus basketball? Then for complements, the cross price elasticity of demand is negative. You raise the price of milk, you reduce the demand for Oreos, and the size of that cross price elasticity shows how closely complementary the two goods are. Okay. So here, the price of good B increases by 4%, causing the quantity demanded of good A to decrease by 6%. So first of all, are these goods substitutes or are they complements? And what is the cross price elasticity of demand? Okay. It's minus 1.5, minus 6% divided by 4%. And it means that they're complements. Okay. Because, you know, if you make B more expensive, people don't want as much of good A. That's their complements. Okay. This is like peanut butter and jelly. income elasticity of demand. That's how sensitive the quantity demanded of a good is to changes in your income. Okay. Just have my moment of paranoia. Am I recording? I am. So for normal goods, the income elasticity of demand is positive. For inferior goods, the income elasticity of demand is negative. But what about necessities and luxuries? What's the answer to that? I'll let you think about that. Okay. Normal goods can be income elastic or not. For income elastic goods, income elasticity is greater than 1. For income inelastic goods, income inelasticity is positive, but less than 1. And I'll just let you think about how necessities and luxuries fit into that story. So here's just ramen noodles. So her income, she consumes 10 boxes a year when her income is 40,000. After her income falls to 30,000, she now has 40 boxes per year. So calculate her income elasticity of demand. What's it going to be? First of all, is it going to be positive or negative? Well, she's consuming, as her income goes up, she would consume less. So there's going to be a negative sign. And in fact, minus 4.2 is the correct answer to that. And I'll let you work that out. Okay. By the way, price elasticity of supply, same idea. So price goes, if I can get more money for my good, I'm going to produce more of it, but how strong is that relationship? Because the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by percentage change in the price I can actually get for the good that I'm trying to sell. That's the price elasticity of supply. The market price goes up, how much more of that good am I willing to supply? So here's extreme cases. This is the case where it's perfectly inelastic. I just have a fixed quantity available that I can sell. That's this vertical line. And then here's one where where the supply curve is really, really sensitive to price. If I can provide as much of that good as I want, the overall, say it's an industry curve, the industry will supply as many pizzas as you want when the price is $12. If the price goes above $12, they'll produce an incredible amount. Price goes below $12, not going to produce any. That's what that curve gives us right here. So if the price goes up a little bit, wow, you're going to increase the available supply. Price drops a little bit, wow, you're really going to, the amount of available supply is just going to plummet. Okay. Now, when would you get a vertical supply curve? How does that happen in real life? Maybe there's some sort of technological limitation, like there's only one available cell phone frequency, or maybe think about my Cape Cod example. Bridge closes. There's so much milk and eggs on the island when the bridge closes, and that's it. The supply of milk and eggs is just fixed because you can't bring any more in. So the supply curve is just going to be vertical like that. So in the short run, by the way, this is a short run supply curve. You could imagine if we thought about this in a longer term perspective, it might get a little bit more complicated. If we think, say, about Walmart, how many snow shovels they have when that snowstorm hits. Okay. So any increase in price just has no impact on the available supply of that good. It's completely inelastic supply curve. Here's a completely elastic supply curve there. Okay. So as I just said, that's what we've got for elasticity of supply, and nothing interesting to say there. What determines the price elasticity of supply? First of all, how cheap is it to expand production? Maybe I need some new input that's just hard to get a hold of, or I'm operating pretty much at capacity in my factory. Then the supply is pretty inelastic. If production can be increased cheaply, then usually supply is going to be much more elastic. Okay? Availability of inputs is one key thing. Time matters a lot. In the long run, price goes up and it's attractive to produce more, suppliers are going to figure out how to do that. It's true for an individual company, and it's true for the whole industry. So here's how computer manufacturer makes an experimental computer chip that critics praise, leading to a huge increase in demand. How elastic is supply in the short run? It's probably pretty inelastic in the short run. They built some sort of a experimental facility that can produce these chips, but in a pretty modest amount. But in the long run, wow, then they really could respond to that huge increase in demand. So short run, probably pretty inelastic supply. Long run is probably much more elastic. Okay. Now let's talk about taxes some. Jumping ahead to chapter 7 a little bit. How am I doing on time? Let's see. 10:38, Tuesday night. So how do taxes affect supply and demand? What factors determine who bears the actual burden of a tax? What are the costs and benefits of a tax? And why is the cost of a tax greater than the tax revenue generated? The social cost of a tax is almost always greater than the tax revenue generated. The only exception to that is if there's like a big externality, like the social cost of a carbon tax could be negative because you're preventing, very harmful pollution. What's the difference between progressive and regressive taxes? We'll say a little bit about that. Trade-off between equity and efficiency in the design of a tax system. Okay? So taxes drive a wedge between the price that buyers pay and the price that sellers receive. Let me say that again. Prices drive a wedge between the price that buyers pay and the price that sellers receive. That's the key concept, and that's what leads to a lot of deadweight loss issues. Now, to analyze the effect, we could there's two scenarios: when the tax is levied on sellers or when the tax is levied on buyers. Turns out, by the way, that the net effect is, if I say I have a $1 tax on a 6-pack of beer, if I levy it on the sellers or I levy it on the buyers, it turns out it doesn't matter. It has the same ultimate economic impact. Politically, by the way, it looks a lot better if you levy it on the seller usually than on the buyers. Economic doesn't matter. It's important to know which side of the market is being taxed when you sort of draw the graphs, but in real world, it kind of works out to the same amount of government revenue is collected, the same number of 6-packs of beer is sold, consumers pay the same amount, producers get the same amount net of the tax. It doesn't matter which side of the market we're officially taxing in a well-functioning market. There's some weird exceptions to that, like if you start to hit some constraint like the minimum wage or something like that. In general, it doesn't matter which side of the market you tax. The incidence of a tax is sort of who really pays it. And that turns out to depend on the elasticity of supply and the elasticity of demand, not which side of the market is officially paying. And that turns out to be an important point. You may know that in Social Security, that the way Social Security is set up, the employer pays half and the employee pays half for Social Security taxes. Turns out workers pay almost the entire cost of Social Security taxes because the supply curve for labor is very inelastic compared to the demand for labor. So the incidence of a tax is who really pays for it, and that's just completely different from who officially pays for it. Okay? Here's an example of supply and demand for hotel rooms in Potterville, and and there's you can see there's a market clearing price which is like $80, something like that. Okay? So there's an equilibrium quantity, equilibrium price that comes from this particular market. Okay? And let's just imagine that we charge a $40 excise tax a tax charge on each unit sold. So now the equilibrium price of a hotel room is going to go up to $100 a night. And it's going to turn out, then hotel guests bear some of the burden of that tax, but hotel owners also bear some of the burden of that tax. So let's see if we can work this thing out. So the supply curve was before, here's what it looked like before. Sorry, these slides are terrible. Here's the supply curve before the tax is imposed. The entire supply curve is going to shift up, and it's going to go through point A instead now. Okay. The supply curve shifts up by the amount of the tax. Oh, I see. It's not that there's actually, if you look closely here, you'll see that there's the old supply curve is actually there. It's just I didn't see it. Got it. Got it. So we can see that excise, that this thing is going up by $40, but the price of a hotel room only went up by $20. So they're kind of equally sharing, the supply side and the demand side in this case are kind of equally sharing the cost of that hotel room by a big decline in the number of hotel rooms that are actually rented out. And there's a big deadweight loss, which corresponds to all the lost consumer surplus and producer surplus in this triangle here. Okay? So there's going to be government revenue. There's going to be 5,000 rooms sold. Each of those rooms, the government gets $40. So I take 5,000 rooms times $40. This rectangle in here, that's how much government revenue there's going to be. But wow, there's, the consumer surplus has gone way down. Now the consumer surplus is just this little triangle in here. Oops. And the producer surplus similarly has gone way down too. It's just this little triangle in here. Okay? So big loss of consumer and producer surplus. Some of that has gone into, has gone into government revenue. But some of that is just deadweight loss. That's just consumer and producer surplus. That just didn't happen because people didn't rent out those rooms. There were a bunch of capitalist acts between consenting adults that just never occurred once the tax was imposed. And it's everything to the right of these points here. Okay. Now, the incidence of a tax, as we mentioned, does not depend on who officially pays the tax. In this case, the official person paying the tax is the supply side, but you can see that they're kind of splitting that cost. Here's one where we do exactly the same tax, but we impose it on the hotel guests. So I guess if I had read the top of the thing, I would have known that immediately. It's exactly the same tax, but it's just imposed on the other side of the market. So now, instead of the supply curve shifting up by the amount of the tax, the demand curve shifts down by the amount of the tax. And I would say, what's going on intuitively? The idea there is I'm paying the hotelier $100, but then I also have to pay the tax. So wow, it's, if the official price is $60, but I also have to pay that $40 tax, it's kind of like in the old situation where the official price was $100 and I didn't have a tax. So, in the new situation, a price of $60 is exactly the equivalent to the old situation, the price being $100. And that's true at every point along this curve. The whole demand curve just shifts down by $40. A really bad explanation. Sorry, I did a horrible job with this particular slide, but the whole demand curve shifts down by the amount of the tax that the guests have to pay directly to the government, not to the it doesn't go through the hotelier. Notice now we end up at an official price of $60. 5,000 rooms are still rented, and how much is the guests are actually paying $60 to the hotelier plus $40 to the government. There's $100 coming out of the guest's pocket, and the hoteliers are getting to keep 60. Now let's just go back for a minute to the case where the hotelier has to pay. So now the hotelier gets $100 in that case, but it's got to pay 40 to the government. The hotelier only gets to keep $60. And which is exactly the same as what they were keeping, what they're keeping over here. And they're selling exactly the same number of hotel rooms. So everything is kind of exactly the same when the tax is imposed on the hotel guest as when the tax is imposed on the hotelier, just kind of the optics are different. But that's the only thing that matters. Then, now, which side of the market ultimately pays more of a tax? It turns out that the tax really falls most heavily on the most inelastic side of the market. If the supply curve is a lot less elastic than the demand curve, then the suppliers are going to bear most of the cost of the tax. If the suppliers have a more elastic supply curve than the demand side has a demand curve, then the demand side ends up paying more. So it's whichever side is more rigidly fixed, they bear most of the cost of the tax. Okay. So in this particular case, for example, here we have a very elastic supply curve, this for gas, very inelastic demand curve. So if I put a tax on gas, in this particular scenario, the consumers are going to pay most of it. Okay. So we put on a tax of $1 per gallon. Because the demand curve is so steep, really the consumers end up kind of being stuck with almost all of it. And it doesn't matter if I shifted, if I put the tax officially on the suppliers, it still ends up that if I take this curve and I just shift it up by $1, it's still going to hit this point. It doesn't matter. What matters is that if the amount that the sellers got in their pockets was less, they would just be willing to produce a lot less gas. So the consumers would love to pass on a lot of that tax onto the suppliers. They kind of can't do that. They just wouldn't. The consumers are too rigid in their demand for gas to really get away with that. It turns out almost all of that tax ends up falling on consumers. And if we reverse this and we have the supply curve being very rigid and the demand curve being very price sensitive, you get the opposite result. That the sellers would love to try to push it onto their consumers, but when they try to do that, consumers just stop buying the product. And so the equilibrium is that, is that the elastic side of the market doesn't have to pay very much of the tax. I'll let you read that in the book. Here's one where the suppliers are very inelastic, the demanders are very elastic. If there's an increase in taxes, it's going to fall almost entirely on the supply side in this particular example. And so this particular example, there's a big tax imposed on parking spaces, and it's almost all going on producers. That if you took this supply curve and you just lifted it up by $5, just take this whole curve and you have a new supply curve. This is $5 higher. Turns out it goes right through this point that's only 50 cents. Only 50 cents is being passed on to the consumers. And it's just because this curve is just so vertical compared to this curve. So I'll let you, if you look at chapter 7, it's well explained in that spot. And it's really because there's only so many parking spaces. That's kind of that's kind of a pretty well-defined good that it's just hard to make more of. Yeah. So an example where people hadn't thought through some of these elasticities. 1990, there's a big tax increase applied to luxury goods like pleasure boats, things like that, and they expected to make a lot of money from this tax increase because there's a pretty big market for luxury boats. But unfortunately, didn't happen because people just stopped buying those boats. That the sale of boats went way down. 30 30,000 jobs were lost. And it turns out that the luxury tax just didn't raise any revenue. And what was happening was that just people just stopped buying, luxury boats, and they just, I don't know if they bought Rolex watches or what they bought, but they just bought different luxury goods once that tax was imposed. Okay. So this is just what I said before, that if demand is more elastic than supply, producers are going to bear most of the cost. That's just what it is. Okay. So, so junk food tax. So here's an interesting question. What has to happen if we're trying to create a public health benefit? And so we put on a tax on junk food or on cigarettes. Would we have a bigger public health benefit if junk food demand were elastic or if it were inelastic? Of course, the answer is elastic. If the demand is very sensitive to price, then if you raise the price of something, people are going to consume a lot less of it. And so one of the challenges we have, if we thought that, for example, with cigarettes, one of the big arguments people had was that people are addicted, they're still going to consume the same amount of cigarettes they always have. The tobacco tax is not going to have a public health benefit. It'll just punish smokers who tend to have lower incomes. It turns out over the long run, cigarette taxes definitely do help, but they do have some distributional problems. But if the demand for junk food is very elastic, then you'd expect to see a large public health benefit from a policy like this. Okay. Now, by the way, one of the interesting things for, say, a tobacco tax is if you're just trying to raise money, you would do better if the supply and demand were inelastic. If you put on a whopping tax. So, here's an example where with pretty elastic supply and demand, when we're thinking about putting a tax on hotel rooms. Well, we put on a tax, we don't raise that much money because what happens is if the price of a hotel room starts to really include a good chunk of that $40 tax, demand just goes way down. And so you end up with a new, this tax, you end up with the market equilibrium moves from E to A. In this particular case, $20 increase in the price leads to a pretty large reduction, reduces by half the number of hotel rooms that are rented. So, so disappointing tax revenue in this particular example, because both the supply and the demand curves are shown as being so price sensitive that when you do something that raises the price, it just really dramatically reduces the size of the market. So increasing the tax rate does not necessarily increase revenue. And it really depends on how are the supply and demand going to respond. Let's see if we can get this thing to fully deploy. So if we put an excise tax of $20 on per unit, you're only making $20, but you're selling but there's still a lot of hotel rooms being rented out. If what happens, and suppose we have a $60 tax on, well, if that sort of kills the market, it sort of, moves, you go way, way down in the demand curve. It's true that you're getting $60 per room in terms of the height, but wow, you're selling a lot fewer hotel rooms. So it's a little unclear the way these curves are drawn, whether this rectangle is bigger than that rectangle. But if you have really, really elastic supply and demand, you want to be careful that if you put on a really high tax, you could end up hurting yourself in terms of your ability to raise the most revenue. Now, if price elasticity of supply and demand is low, then you can really raise a lot of money with a tax. But when price elasticities are high, then then it can be more of a dilemma. Okay? Now, what's the cost of taxation? Creates a deadweight loss, prevents mutually beneficial transactions. So let's just draw in. Here's what happens when you put a tax on. Okay, so we put on a tax that's this height. So the equilibrium goes from right over here to some point up here. And at that point up there, what do we know? Well, the government's revenue now is going to be the area of this rectangle, because this is the number of, there's Q sub T units sold, and each of those units, the government gets this much excise tax. Some of that is coming from producers, some of it is coming from consumers, but we lose all the producer and consumer surplus that came from all of these consumers buying the good. They just all stop buying. So all of these producers that would have sold to these people, they lose their whatever producer surplus they would have gotten, which is shown by this triangle F. And all of these consumers, they would have gotten this consumer surplus triangle, but they just stopped buying. So altogether, B plus F, that's a deadweight loss that we've created through this excise tax. It's lost producer surplus, lost consumer surplus. Okay. So taxes create revenue and also creates deadweight loss. And the deadweight loss is really, the triangle is really, the height of it is the amount of the tax, and I should say the base of it is the amount of the tax, and the height of it is how much the quantity sold goes down. Okay? Sorry, it keeps advancing when I hit the mouse pad. So all this consumer surplus in here and all this producer surplus down here is lost from that tax. And that's kind of a trade-off. You get the area of this rectangle as government revenue, and what you paid is the area of this triangle, which is the deadweight loss. And so there's a trade-off in taxes that between the deadweight loss and the revenue raised. Okay. Now, we haven't shown all the costs of taxes. One is that there's administrative costs for taxes. There's resources used for collection and all that kind of stuff. So taxes are kind of expensive. The total inefficiency of a tax is the deadweight loss plus the administrative costs, and those can be substantial. Okay. So I'll let you do this little example here, where so you can see the size of the deadweight loss associated with a tax is much bigger when you have very elastic demand than if you have inelastic demand. If demand is pretty fixed, you put the tax on, consumers pay it, they're not real happy, but you've transferred some consumer surplus to the government. You haven't really lost that. It just goes to the government. Okay. So let's see if we can use these examples. So here's a really elastic demand curve on the left here, and you end up with a pretty big deadweight loss. Okay. And here's a really elastic supply curve, kind of gets the same effect. When you put the tax on, the quantity supplied goes down, and we have a big deadweight loss. So if one or both of these curves is really price sensitive, taxes tend to bring a big deadweight loss. Now, if both of the curves are very inelastic, the deadweight loss of taxes is really pretty small. If we look at this thing, let's see if we can, there's a little bit of a decline in the quantity demanded, but not very much. So this distance here is very low. And so the area of this triangle is pretty small. So if you have really inelastic supply and demand together, the deadweight loss of putting a tax on is really pretty small. If the goal in tax policy is efficiency, then you really want to tax goods that have the lowest price elasticities of supply and demand. And you can see this actually leads to a normative challenge. If you're going to do that, a tax on insulin would be incredibly efficient. But it's not clear that that's the fair thing. And so fairness doesn't always go in the direction of efficiency in this. So, minimizing deadweight loss is not necessarily the right policy goal if there's important equity issues, say in the case of inelastic demand for a life-saving drug. You might think about this little assignment. If you wanted to have the most efficient excise tax you could, what goods would you tax? Now, there's a couple principles of tax fairness that are worth mentioning. One is the benefit principle. Those who benefit from public spending should bear the burden of a tax that pays for that spending. So this is kind of the idea, like, why do we have tolls on roads? There's a bunch of reasons why we have tolls on roads. One is to reduce congestion, but there's also this kind of fundamental idea that if I'm somebody using that road a lot, I should pay for the upkeep of that road. There's also the ability to pay principle that that just people who are more affluent should pay more in taxes. And there's often a trade-off between equity and efficiency. And I should say, which is usually, I would say there's often a trade-off between equity and efficiency. Sometimes there's no trade-off. Right now, if we hired more IRS auditors, there would be a lot less tax cheating by rich people. There'd be a lot more revenue, and probably there'd be more equity and more efficiency, because a lot of the tax evasion strategies cause a lot of economic inefficiencies. So a tax base is the measure, like say total income in an area or total property values, that determine how much tax an individual or firm is going to pay, or an entire area is going to pay. So an income tax is taxes on people's wages and investments. A payroll tax is really based on the earnings that an employer pays an employee. A sales tax is based on the value of goods sold. Profits tax, of course, is based on a firm's profit. Property taxes depend on the value of a property, and a wealth tax depends on an individual's wealth. So there's just different ways you could try to tax people in America. And a tax structure specifies how the tax depends on the tax base. A progressive tax takes a larger share of the income of higher income taxpayers than of lower income taxpayers. Regressive is kind of the opposite. And the marginal tax rate is the percentage of an increase in income that's taxed away. So, if I earned $100 more at my current income level, how much of that would I have to pay in more taxes now? So, if my marginal tax rate is 37%, it means I earned another $100, $37 more in taxes. So you can imagine that these are all important considerations as we think about the equity of tax policy. So here's the U.S. taxes in 2018, U.S. federal taxes raised about $1.6 trillion. State taxes about $420 billion. Payroll taxes $1.334 trillion. State and local sales taxes $411 billion. Profits taxes $147 billion rather, and 58 at the state level, and property taxes at the state and local level, $562 billion. And there's just nothing here because the federal government doesn't really tax that. Now here we have federal, state, and local taxes, a percentage of income by income category. And it's kind of interesting, first of all, how much the state and local looks regressive and how progressive the federal one looks in comparison. The top 1% just really pays much higher federal taxes, much lower state and local taxes. A lot of the taxes here are sales taxes, things like that the lower income people are just paying a large percentage of. By the way, if you look across nationally, U.S. has some of the lowest taxes in the world, despite our high healthcare costs and other things that the government helps to pay for. So we're definitely on the low side. And you can see that in the quality of some of our services. So that's going to end this. And I'm going to stop.